Going to try my pepeha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Ko Mickey Smith, toko inoa. Kia ora, welcome, thank you for joining me. And thank you, Brian, and thank you, Jackson, for inviting me here today. I am new to CLAMP, so we have a little preview of work upstairs for you, and I'm going to show you some work here today. So I'm here after being away for 11 years. I moved in 2011 with my husband, 2011, 2012, and we went to New Zealand with our 2.5-year-old. And it was an interesting shift. I think, you know, everyone's got the inevitable, everyone's enviable of the New Zealand passport right now. And I know everyone would love one, but it's not actually what you probably think it is when you get there. New Zealand's a very different culture. You know, we have 5 million people across the entire country as opposed to the 5 million people probably in Manhattan. So there was a bit of a settlement, and I'm sorry, bear with us on the screen, and I can share any of these with you later, but there's a bit of a settlement curve happening, and I really loved this graph when I moved because there's all this anticipation of going, and this is something that Immigration New Zealand gives people, and there's all this anticipation of going and how exciting it's going to be and how much fun it's going to be, and then there's sort of this crash and a downturn where there's fight or flight, and you either stay or go. And I see it happen to people over and over and over again when they come to New Zealand, because you come with your, you know, I have friends that have just come now that are in sort of a deep depression because you get there and you start over again. So I went to New Zealand and started over again. And in preparing for this today, I really wanted to talk about not only this work that's upstairs, but I've been thinking a lot about things that cross my practice all the way across the board. So I've always dealt with books and archives. I've always dealt with libraries and architecture. And then another theme that's come up more recently for me is mourning and grief, not only in the books that we're leaving, but personally. So there's a whole, I talked to a few people about this, like, oh, how much of my personal story should I put into this? And I was telling my husband, oh my God, you know, when I gave this hospice speech recently to 400 people asking them to raise money, it was easy. And it's harder to come to New York. And someone said to me, well, that's because no one's going to judge you at a hospice talk, and everyone's going to judge you in New York. So, but I think I'm in pretty safe hands here today. So I'll read a couple of these things to you in case you can't see them. So I'm going to start a little bit about personal stuff, jump back and forward into time. And feel free, we'll have a conversation at the end of it. And you can either ask me your technical or your personal questions. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright quote. "The longer I live, the more beautiful life becomes. If you foolishly ignore beauty, you will soon find yourself without it. Your life will be impoverished. But if you invest in beauty, it will remain with you all the days in your life." And in New Zealand, it's a very different culture than we have here. Home, and I thought a lot about architecture and like, what has happened in the last 10 years? I've actually really engaged with the architectural community that I never did here. And what is it that has happened? And part of it was that we built our own house. And it seems like a little thing, but it's actually a big thing to do this. In New Zealand, there's no 401ks, there's no IRAs. Everyone, they've recently, in the last 10 years, they have implemented something for people to save, but it's such a young, progressive culture, and it's a new culture. You know, it's not a new culture in terms of for European migration to New Zealand. It's only been 185 years, and when the Europeans settled in New Zealand, they were all given quarter acres of land. And so there was, those of you that know Aaron's old band was Quarter Acre Lifestyle. That's what that was named after, was this quarter acre that every pakeha in New Zealand was given at a certain period of time. So it's really a big dream, and Aaron had this dream that he wanted to build a house in New Zealand. So we did that, and his brother was an architect. It was a bit messy, and it was a bit complicated to do it, but we did it, and we did it for our small family. this was so easy to do before. Now that I'm looking at all of our friends, it's harder. Living in our house is like living in an artwork. And it's living in a memorial. Because my husband, Aaron, passed away 5 years ago. God, I practiced this so many times. He passed away 5 years ago. But living in this house is like living with Aaron, because his standard was so high and his aesthetic was so strong. And it is a pleasure every day to see how the light hits, and I'll remember how we made the decisions about where these little windows are going to go and what corner is mitered, and every bit of that house is a jewel to me and is a jewel to our family, so I'm very thankful that we still have that. And have New Zealand. It's a really interesting place when you start dealing with the land and architecture, and how you interact with it. This is my now husband, Carl, who's a gorgeous thing taking care of our now 3 kids in that house that we've added another room on and grown our family. And this is down on the South Island where we are now working on another hut. We're ready for the climate change. A cyclone is hitting New Zealand right now, actually. I'm quite worried about it. Everybody's been told to have three days of materials to pack up and leave, because the cyclone is, they say it's a storm of 100 years in New Zealand. In Auckland, there was just a horrible flood that killed a number of people, and the ground is already wet, so it's a big storm that's coming. This is on the South Island, and this is our off-grid hut that we're building, so it will be complete with solar and spring water, and it's a very interesting, I keep being involved in these projects where we're building these high, pretty intensely designed, collaborating with architects, doing these intensely designed pieces on very steep parcels of land. So I know a lot about earthquakes and a lot about screw piles and things like that. But I think part of the reason I wanted to share this too is because it sort of felt like when I got there, I was so disappointed to leave my New York art life here. And we had to resettle. So we started a business, we built this house, we started everything over again. And I used to think that that was a negative thing. And now I know that I learned so much about it, and that everything that you do is part of your work and informs your work. So one other piece about architecture that I'll address is this project that I did when I arrived about Andrew Carnegie. So those of us in America know a lot about Andrew Carnegie and the buildings that he built, and Carnegie Hall and the 2,700 libraries he built in the US, but he built hundreds more around the world. And I didn't realize this. I grew up in Minnesota where there's this high intensity of Carnegie libraries, and we would go to them quite regularly. It was the first library that I ever went to in my hometown of Duluth. And when we got to New Zealand, I thought, what the hell is there a Carnegie Library doing here? And so Max and I jumped on a train and went out to Onehunga and discovered that there were 17 of them in New Zealand, in various states of disrepair, right? So there's just a few that were libraries. There were several that were demolished. There were several that had been repurposed. There were some in New Zealand. It was a really amazing way for me to get to know the community of archives and libraries and what they do. But in New Zealand, it was really interesting to learn too about, the libraries used to be for payment, and part of Carnegie's structure was that everything was supposed to be free and open, and there were some conditions, and they were architectural conditions. The conditions were the reason that we have children's reading rooms in libraries were because he required that children could go there. He required that women would go. This woman is actually standing in the women's area of the library, which that was a fight in New Zealand over and over again that I read in all of the papers, is that they wouldn't let women into the libraries. And when there were all kinds of complaints about it, and when they finally got around to, they would send complaint letters back here to New York to say, they're not free, and they're not letting women into the libraries. So when one of the libraries collapsed from an earthquake, the city wrote back to the foundation and asked for money to rebuild, and they said, sorry, no way, you didn't follow the rules. So the project was really interesting in that I got to work with new curators, and I got to work in large-scale video installation, and to travel throughout New Zealand. So we did. I worked with a few new organizations, and then we also started to work with libraries in Australia and Fiji. So in a bigger South Pacific context, the libraries became quite important. So I have a little piece that I'm going to read to you here, and then I'll get on to volume upstairs. This is from a journal I kept. This is also important just in terms of artistic growth since I've gone to New Zealand. When I left here, I always just considered myself a photographer. And, you know, oh, well, maybe I might be an artist. Oh, yeah, photographer. But in New Zealand, I've started to work in video. I've started to work in metal. I started to write. And this curator required that I wrote for this show. And I thought, well, I can't write anything. I'm not interested. But it turns out over my years in New Zealand, I've discovered that I indeed can. For the first time in 6 years, I boarded a plane with nothing but a weighty camera bag, flying from Auckland to Dunedin, where it's confusingly cold down south, autumn and April. In my former life, I would have tackled this ambitious project in one go, creating a long residency. And instead, over 3 days, I'll document 5 Carnegie buildings, allowing just a few hours in each site, in Gore, Balclutha, Dunedin, Fairlie, and Timaru, a new residency reality. I could leave my heroic husband with a sick child and a puppy for a month, but all we can spare are 3 nights and 4 days. Work expands to the time allowed. The first stop was a curiously round building in Gore. Aren't they all this shape? Said the gallery attendant. The lone visitor turned art gallery bolted the moment he noticed my camera. Surely he was running for more than the lens. The songs that suggest the criminals run and disappear to Mexico, I'd go to a sheep station on the South Island. It appears to be empty the way North Dakota was before oil. And although Aaron often welcomes overseas with a quip, New Zealand, Aaron often welcomes overseas guests with a quip, New Zealand, where the men are men and the sheep are nervous. But what happens when the men and the sheep are nervous? So the South Island is a very interesting place, and so is Fiji. This is a Fijian library that was alive. I mean, this was like the living, breathing libraries of our childhood. I mean, packed with people doing, it was loud, it was interesting, doing work. You know, the building was barely held up, and it was one of the most interesting places I'd been. So the year after Aaron died, I decided there was only one thing that I had to do, and was to finish this project and publish the book. And I have 3 of them left, and they are actually the last 3. They've been hiding in friends' attics here in New York, so I asked him to bring them today. So this was a project that really was a labor of love that through those first years in New Zealand I was able to do. And thankfully have gotten back on my feet, back to volume, a project that's been in the works for over 20 years. So this, for those of you that can't read it, this was a quote written by Louis Menand about my work. One important thing to remember about these images is their foundness. The photographs are taken from life. They're not made from props in a studio. The artist was on library safari. And I love that. I mean, when he wrote it, I thought, oh, yeah, that's what I do. I hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt about 75% of the time, and actually making the work only takes me a moment. So I've traveled throughout the US and Europe and New Zealand hunting for titles, primarily titles that are bound periodicals and journals. These are some very early works that I'm showing here in public libraries. So these are, I think I'm looking around to see if I really have to explain it to anyone, but I think everyone here might be of the age where you remember what these are. I do have to explain this work sometimes. Well, Beatrice, these are magazines and they stick them together. So if you have 12 months of a magazine, they bind them together, and there's a section of the library where they were. And in the process of digitization, these works have, the newspapers all got scanned and put on microfilm and microfiche, and a number of things in the library, when you say, oh, you can't throw away books, the things that don't get scanned and the things that don't get looked at are actually these periodicals. So they're part of our culture, and I'm really interested in them for that reason. However, I don't touch, I don't open, I don't look at what's inside of the books. I'm more interested in them translating and evolving to being conceptual works of art, especially when they're on a larger scale. So it's important to me, more important to me, what the title is, what the spines look like. It's really an exercise in sort of visual poetry that I'm looking for, not what the content of the magazine is. These are often large-scale installations. Hopefully, I would love to have one of these installations in this gorgeous soaring space at some point. This is a perfect example. When I moved from Minnesota to New York, blood was bound in red in Minnesota, and when we came to New York, it was bound in blue. So there's this entirely different sense of humor that the librarians have, which I really love. They've got an amazing sense of humor, and it's quite fun to play with. Binding probe in pink only makes sense, and binding burns in a variety of oranges really is going above and beyond the call of duty, and I'm always appreciative when I find it. But it's like the Vogue title. Over the years, because I've been doing this for so long, over the years I've found Vogue printed in red and blue and pink and every color you could imagine. Oh, this is my microphone tape. I'll leave that. Sorry. This is another piece. The other thing I wanted to talk about for me, for my work, how perceptions of work change over time. And I know many of you here own my work, and I'm sure your perceptions, and you live with it. I would hope that your perceptions have changed with it over time. This piece, there's only been one that's ever sold of this particular edition, and it was a woman who came to my studio before Aaron and I moved from Minneapolis to New York. And she came to the studio, and as I was helping her, it was a we're leaving sale. And she was putting the piece in the back of the car, and she said, "I don't know why I'm buying this. My husband just died of cancer." And I thought, well, I don't know why you're buying it either. That sounds insane. And just last year, I got a note from her, and she said, "I don't know if you remember me, but I bought this piece, and my husband had just died of cancer, and I have remarried now. And this piece has been sitting in my closet, and I really just, if it can go to a home, I will never hang it. If you know someone who wants it, can you help?" And I couldn't even respond because part of her email, too, was my husband had died of a brain tumor, which is what Aaron, my husband, had died of. So my assistant responded, and we actually found a home for a friend in Minneapolis who, ironically, had his own very serious journey with cancer, and he said, "I would like to take it." And John has got this piece. He managed to barter for, he's a glass blower, and he bartered a number of glass blowing pieces. So Reichel now has this piece in his home. So I think Paul Shambroom used to say, "I work on a project." I remember seeing him in Minneapolis, and he said, "I work on a project for 7 years, and then I work on it 2 more. And I thought, that's such a long time. Like, why would you work on something that long? Meantime, here I am. Critics have said, "Can you get this woman out of the library already?" And the longer I work on it, and the faster the books go in the dumpster, and the faster they disappear, the more passionate I get about it because my subjects are disappearing. And in most cases, these are the last records of them. These are not being digitized or done so. In a way, I think of them as portraits. And my perception of them has changed. Also, my perception of the titles have changed. And sometimes the titles become more important culturally. During the pandemic, this actually, New Zealand Outlook, I thought, oh, Jacinda's pretty amazing. What is she doing all over the world? Maybe it's time to pull that one out and share it. New Zealand Outlook and Trans-Tasman, at one point during the pandemic, we had the Trans-Tasman bubble between New Zealand and Australia, which was our big hope of getting out. Because we were quite isolated for a very long time and sort of shifted. When you guys were free, we were locked up, and vice versa. So it's been interesting to me as an artist to see how my own perception of work has evolved. And some of you might remember I've been working on these Who's Who pieces for years and years, and they just keep coming no matter where I go. And things in New Zealand have been different too. I've run into things like handwritten books. I've never seen that before anywhere in the world, and they often write on their periodicals by hand. So there's a few more images. These I'll share. This is culturally a little bit different. This is the famous five, and I didn't have any relationship with this book. You guys all look a bit blank, but this is like in Europe, and there's a yes.
My mother had it.
Yeah.
When I was the cover was green.
Yeah. Well, it's quite different. So I've never wanted to photograph older books, but I just recently did a portrait for a friend who has a very short time to live, and he called me and said, "Hey, Mickey, would you be interested in photographing I'll leave this happy one up here. Would you be interested in photographing my collection? I don't have this piece with me today." But it was fascinating. I went to his house, and I ended up kind of having this portrait session with him. I'd known him, and then he sort of set me free on his library, and I created this work for him. And actually, the day before I left, we sat down, and I was showing it to him, and he said, that everyone is going to look at that piece, and they are going to know that's me. But this is Greg. This is my piece. And I thought, in terms of evolution for work, that's one of the most important things I can do, is because now I can create this piece that will carry on for his family and his friends when he's gone. I also just threw a few images in here because I am really quite interested in how work lives in people's homes. And I've been asking people lately to send me images of their work in their house. I see Jen like, oh, I forgot to send. Some of you have, but it's really been interesting for me to find out where the work lives and how it breathes and how it changes throughout time and place. So showing some of this work in New Zealand has different connotations than it does here in the States, and showing it in 2005 versus showing it in 2023 is an entirely different thing as well. This piece is another example. In New Zealand, the endeavor is how Cook came to New Zealand. And so for everyone there, this is the pioneering spirit. This means something entirely different than it meant to everyone here. If you can't read it, the title is Endeavor, and it's been wiped out that it was written one way. It was written the American way, and then they realized it was a British publication, so they scrubbed it out and re-stamped it. So I don't touch or manipulate or light the books. These are as I find them. And I've left, when I photographed blood, I also photographed gut, and pain was on the bottom shelf. And I couldn't get there with a tripod, so pain had to stay behind. I'm going to jump around a little bit more, and then we can do questions. This is a Rumi quote: "Don't grieve, anything you lose comes around in another form." And as I've been thinking about grieving and loss and memory and how it comes across in all of my work, I actually found more than I realized. This is part of a project called Denudation, and these books were wrapped up to be carried away. Again, I feel this urgency in the work that I'm doing, and because more and more the libraries are being shut down, and they are going. This is a library in Wall Street where I photographed this piece. This was the only thing left in the entire library. The spine, if you can't see it, says "Will to Win," and it's actually a legal index. But when I photographed there, all of the library shelves were empty, and so I was photographing these sort of remnants of what the books had left behind. And I had photographed that Will to Win piece and finished this session at this library, and then realized, why did I leave that there? It was the only thing left in the entire library. All of the shelves were empty. There were plastic bags everywhere. Why did I leave it behind? And I went upstairs and grabbed it, and it sat in the bottom of my camera bag for years. The print is sold out, but that little spine now lives in our wall and really is this mantra that has, again, changed its meaning from what it was from the time that I picked it up in that Wall Street library to where it is now. And these shelves changed their meaning the day that I photographed them. The librarian said, "What are you doing downstairs?" And I said, "Oh, well, all the books are up here." He said, "Yeah, but it's more interesting down there." And I said, "I'm photographing all the books, or all the dust." And he said, "Oh, that's not dust. That's 9/11 dust. All of our windows blew in." And this is what was left after they removed the books, and, which made sense then. At that point, no one had ever seen a mask laying around or plastic gloves, and they were everywhere throughout the library. And the books eventually leave the shelves. So this is something that I'm quite excited about, that I'm going to go tackle in Minnesota this week. For the first time, with the volume series, I come into a library at a different process, either before they start deaccessioning the books, after they have done it, or never really involved with the librarians. The librarians really don't want to have too much to do with it because they get a bad rap. And this particular residency that I'm going to do is going to last for 2 years, hopefully starting at Macalester and going to a number of universities. And I'm working with the librarians in the process of deaccessioning. And so I'm going to Macalester College next week to meet with the librarians. They're going to give me the tour of what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how we can tell the story. And I've told them that I want to lay another one of these book floors. Before I left, these are 3 tons of legal reporters installed in Kentucky. And before I left, I really wanted to pursue this. And I got to New Zealand, and no one throws away any of the books. All the books that make it to New Zealand have been read by everyone a million times. So that kind of cracking of the books before they get thrown away, it doesn't happen. So everything there has been used. It's an island culture. It's people use what you finally get there. They're going to read every page of it. So this I had to leave behind. So I'm really excited to create these floors again. And again, the librarians talking to me just a month ago on Zoom, they said, well, if we're willing, we've thrown them out. They stopped while in our conversation. The chief librarian said, we're going to stop deaccessioning now until you get here. Just told everyone stop until she gets here, which was incredible. And but they said they're having an internal argument about what to do with the books. So half of them are in the dumpster, and I said, I want to make these floors. And one of the librarians says, well, you can't make the floors. It's sacrilegious. You can't walk on the floors. And for those of you that have walked on one of these floors of mine, it does feel a little sacrilegious. On this particular floor, they did yoga classes and kids classes, and they had this entire public programming around standing on the books. So we're trying to do a temporary exhibition of the books they're deaccessioning, but also a permanent installation of the books they're deaccessioning. And the librarians have said, well, we want to help lay them. We want to bring them off the shelves so you don't have to touch them, and put them on the floor and lay them to rest. Again, it just seems to keep coming back and back and back. And I don't know why. I mean, Carlos is here. I don't know why. It never occurred to me that any of these themes ran through my work. I always thought I was having more fun than that. When I was doing the Believe You Me project, looking at, this is in 2010, looking at book backdrops and how they were used. At the time, the only people that used them were porn stars and politicians. They were never used. I was digging through the internet trying to find images of people, occasionally a newscaster, and we all know now half the people in this room have probably composed their bookshelf behind their heads. So I'd like to get back to this. This is Osama bin Laden. He was actually tracked down because of this photograph. They could tell where his books were, and this was one of the key pieces of evidence in one of his videos that he had made. And so I'm interested in reapproaching this because we have all kinds of people that are using books as props these days, and they're mostly vacant props. And you can buy books by the yard if you want to prove you're the eligible bachelor, or if you want to prove you are, whatever it is. You can still shop for them by the yard, have them delivered to your house, install them, and away you go. And then there's this guy. I'm sorry, you guys have suffered through this while we've had Jacinda. The day that this happened and Trump held the Bible up during the protests, I was absolutely gobsmacked. So I will come back to this project in a very different way, but at some point. And finally, I'll share with you a few things that I was working on. This is a quote that Lawrence Weiner wrote for Ankawara. Ankawara is you've probably seen his pieces up at the Dia Beacon, those timepieces that have the date paintings. And ironically, this was written, I used this quote for inspiration for a recent project that I did for the NFT world. And it was in a commission that I did for Obscura. And when I was asked to do the commission, the reason I came to the blockchain and started thinking about what was happening in the blockchain was because I was interested in who was building the library in the blockchain. If there's the metaverse, who is building the library? And I want to be there for what it looks like. So as one of we were commissioned to do, there were several photographers commissioned to create work, and I was really interested in how to tell this story, going from how things work from books to archives to microfilm to microfiche, and finally to NFTs and the metaverse, and how that all fit together. So the quote is, "Time and again to step out of history as we know it and affirm they're still alive, at least for today, and as a hostage of history to hold up a newspaper and attest to the reality of having gotten to the present does give one hope." And Ankawara had an incredible series of works, if you know them, that were about, again, look at poor Beatrice. There was a time when people would be taken hostage, and to prove that people were alive, they would hold up the daily newspaper, and the daily newspaper would prove that they were alive. The front of the New York Times, or whatever it was, would say, on February 11th, 2023, Mickey was standing in this space. Now with AI and with technology, those sort of realities and that proof that he was dealing with conceptually are gone. And so I find it very interesting to see what will happen with all of that, and how this will all evolve. So this is a bit of newer work. Again, dealing with those layers of complexity. And finally, the work that's upstairs, that if you haven't seen, please jump upstairs. And to wrap up this whole random conversation between architecture and grief and memory and books, this is actually just bringing in a little jewelry just to show you how scattered I am. Just to bring in a bit of my metalsmithing practice, I was able to study with this incredible jeweler in the South Island, New Zealand's strongest contemporary jeweler. There's incredible contemporary jewelry in New Zealand. And Kobe said to me, when I was sort of lamenting the fact that I've been distracted by my houses, by the death of my husband, by raising a child, by doing all these things, this life that happens, and you want to get to your work, and you want to get to your work. And he just really said simply to me, it can only come out of life, and everything you do is your work. So these images, there's a larger series of architectural images. There's a few upstairs. It's just a little sampling. These images were all from an architectural library that's been torn down. These books no longer exist. These works were from the University of Auckland Architectural Library. Oh, sorry, those are building, form, and monument. Metropolis, you'll see upstairs. And a few other pieces that really sort of, there's a number of specialty libraries that I work in, but I was quite happy the day that I found the title of this project in the library volume. So, happy to take any questions, and if you have anything, I'm here. So thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you. Yeah. Go on.
Can you walk us through the stages of moving to New Zealand?
I thought you were going to say the stages of grief, which is actually what I've been reading about. The stages?
That thing you shared.
Oh, the settlement curve.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I find that the most fascinating thing ever.
That fight or flight.
Yeah, the fight or flight. Let me see if I can get
Is that
there.
just for New Zealand, or that's?
No, it's kind of for everywhere. I got to cruise all the way back here. Sorry. You used it? How did you use it? Oh, really? Used it from Manhattan to Long Island. That's a settlement curve. It's an entirely different culture. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, it's. I found this fascinating. There's this whole anticipation, and it could be anything. I mean, it's sort of like also if you undertake a major art project, you're sort of like, oh, this is so exciting, and oh, this is going to be amazing. Really excited about it, and then you get the grunt of it, and then you're like, oh, this project sucks. I don't know what I'm going to do until it heads off on its own, and there's the fight or flight of that project. And so I think as artists, we actually kind of do this, but it really was created for immigration and immigrant settling. And when I was listening to the radio this morning about Turkey and the mess that is there now with everyone, size of the city, everyone not having a place to go. And I just think the resettlement and migrant. There's another project that I really want to work on one day, which is called Win a Wife, which has nothing to do with books and archives, but it has everything to do with this immigration question. And it was hard enough to be brought into a country with, Aaron saying, here's a family, and here's a place to live. And I had to, start over with all of my friends and my career. But, there's women that are brought in. I have a profile. I'm Mickey Smith. I am a widower. And I've been shopping for a wife. And you can put them in shopping carts, and you can import wives. There's different immigration status. Like, we've gone through all kinds of horrible immigration hell, as you do when you're married to someone from another country. And now I'm married to an Englishman, so oh my God, it's all just like I've got a world of hell of passports. But yeah, I just think, oh my God, this was hard for me. How about someone who really doesn't know the language and has been brought by someone to live in an entirely new culture and sometimes doesn't get to call home or doesn't get to do anything. So yeah, it's a fascinating little graph. Yeah.
A question about the sources. You said, I believe I read, you said these are all from public libraries. But then that library of the downtown.
Yeah.
The public library, not the institutional library.
It was an institutional, yeah. I use public loosely because I have photographed in, that timepiece was actually from the Time Life archives. And the legal library, it was the oldest law library in the United States, and it was open to the public, but it's open to the public by appointment. So it's not something where you wander through. But primarily, that's what I do, and that's how I can scout, is because I'll wander through any library, and then I'll find the librarians and try to get access. And I've only been turned down for access once, and actually that has been in New Zealand at the National Library. Because they want to give me a security guard that stands with me full time, and they've gotten so much flack because New Zealand, for the first time, has deaccessioned their books. And so they've gotten all kinds of international press about it, and it's because the people in New Zealand are so upset about it, and it's no different than anything we've been doing here or in Europe just because of space. So New Zealand's quite sensitive at the moment, but I will get into that collection eventually, I think. No, the process hasn't changed that much. The process hasn't changed. My perception on it has changed, and what I'm doing and the urgency has changed, and the work that I've made around the volume project has changed. So, when I think about it, I think the volume project will be my life's work, and everything else around it supports that. So I'm hoping next year at the 20th anniversary of the project to publish a book finally of this work. So I'm in the process of getting those proposals out to publishers at the moment. But it hasn't really changed that much, the way I approach it. It's everything else around it that changes the world around it. Anything else? Cool. All right. If there's nothing else, I'll let you do it.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.